there was the assignment where you had to make a bouncing ball, not using objects. This next assignment that's due, you're going to be making a bouncing ball using objects. And then after that, you'll add in a paddle and get closer and closer to Pong. The next assignment after that is making Brick Breaker, still using this idea of objects. So as a coding demo for you to get a sense of what object-oriented programming is, I have this simple animation. We're going to make some bubbles together as a class. They're very similar to bouncing ball in Pong, except it just slowly floats up the screen and then resets at the bottom instead of like bouncing off the wall. So I'll leave that to you as your challenge to get working. So in this example, I have a bubble. I have 3 bubbles, one large one in the middle that slowly crawls up the page, a medium-sized one on the right-hand side that floats up the page, and one tiny fast one that just zooms across from the bottom of the screen up the screen. So this is the current bubble behavior. Notice at the very beginning, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 variables, x, y, size, and speed. Each one of those is tied to and help control behavior of like a bubble. I think x, y with no number after it is the middle bubble. One, x1, y1, size 1, speed 1 is like this medium-sized one. And the tiny one is speed 2. Notice that to get like 3 things to appear on the screen, I have 12 variables. Each of those bubbles have its own set of 4 variables. So then, in my setup function, I have to initialize all those, and I have 12 lines initializing each of those. Notice that they start in different positions, they have different heights and different speeds. That's what this line of code is doing. This everything in setup initializes those 12 variables. And similar to your bouncing ball assignment, in draw, here is the code that controls the behavior of the bubble. So it slowly rises up the screen. As a reminder, y increases positively going down the page. So that's why you have to take away your speed, y equals y minus speed. So that makes the animation grow up the page. And we have a simple if statement here saying if your y-coordinate's ever negative, then reset back to the bottom of the screen. So if we examine this medium-sized bubble, as soon as it hits the top, it's redrawn at the very bottom, so it gets to repeat. So it looks like a neat bubble animation where they just float up forever on your screen. The same behavior is repeated 2 more times for those other 2 bubbles. Any questions about the base code for this bubble animation? Okay, none. So then we move on to the object way of organizing it. I won't be typing as much compared to my previous block, but there are some, we'll just go over like the syntax or the spelling of objects in JavaScript. So right here, we have function bubble. This is your bubble class. And inside your bubble class, before we had like 12 variables, now we're just going to declare them all and initialize them once. Notice that a bubble object has an x, a y, a speed, and a size. The one change is instead of just doing x equals like width over 2, var x, and all that, as we did in this non-object oriented way of programming, we've tied it in to this bubble object using this and the period, also known as the dot operator. I'll explain this probably tomorrow, but so far you have to add this in when doing your class definitions. Like for your bouncing ball assignment, this would look like function ball, this dot x, y, and whatever variables you have that control the ball's behavior. But for this bubble, we have this dot x equals width over 2, so it starts in the middle of the screen. This dot y is the height, so it starts at the bottom of the screen. Size and speed. These things are what make a bubble. It's what a bubble object has. A bubble object has an x-coordinate, it has a y-coordinate, it has a speed, and it has a size. So if you find yourself using that keyword has, then those are called member variables. It's data that's stored to this complicated bubble object, complicated big bubble variable. So, so far, using your understanding of variables, bubbles are just like fancy, or objects are just fancy variables. There's lots of parts that go into it. So it's not just integers, it's not just numbers and letters. Within bubbles, you could actually have functions tied to them. So down here, we're telling a bubble what it means to move. We're telling the bubble what it means to show itself. Notice the syntax here. We still have this dot in front. Like before, you would probably define your own functions looking like this: function move, parentheses, and then you'd fill in what it means to move over here. So instead, we're adding this dot in front of move and then rearranging the function to go like this. And notice this code right here, lines 16 through 19, is very similar to the code we had before over here in lines 30 through 33. All that's different is where we see y and x and all those variables we declared, we add this dot in front of them. Okay, this dot y equals this dot y minus this dot speed. And we're checking this bubble's y coordinate, so we do this dot y is less than 0, this dot y is equal to height. So we're rearranging the code we originally wrote in the non-object oriented way. So this code is tied to movement. It helps the bubble move up the screen. It helps the bubble reset its position. We want to separate that behavior from showing itself. What does it mean for a bubble to show itself? Well, that's just drawing itself to the screen, otherwise known as calling the ellipse function. So we have our ellipse. Previously, where we had ellipse x, y, size, and size, we add this dot in front of all of them, ellipse, this dot x, this dot y, size, this dot size, and this dot size. Any questions about declaring a bubble class? This dot, you stick it in front of your variables, you rearrange a couple things, and you have now a bubble object. So down here, notice that we no longer have to declare xy, size, speed, x1, y1, x2. Instead, we're going to declare some variables for as objects. So down here, I have 3 variables, Bob, Tim, and Sharon. These will soon become bubbles down here. Notice the keyword new, and here is the name of the class we just defined, bubble. So this is initializing the variables to be bubble objects. So Bob is a new bubble, Tim's a new bubble, Sharon's a new bubble. So as we draw to the screen, notice that if we don't have any of the code here, and we click run, nothing appears to the page. So it's just like declaring a variable, initializing it, but not doing anything with it in draw. We just have a blue background, and that's repeated again and again. Notice now, instead of just using the show function, we have to have a name out in front. This is telling a very specific bubble named Bob to show itself. So now when I click run, bob.show, it calls the bubble class specifically for Bob, and it calls its ellipse function. It starts in width over 2, the height, the size is default to like 10, 50, and then the speed. Notice right now Bob doesn't move because we didn't tell Bob to move. That's why we need the second line here. Bob.move animates Bob to then slowly move up the screen. What code is it running? Well, we just scroll up and check down here. Y is decreasing by this dot speed, which is 10, Bob's speed, and then it resets back to the height when it is negative. The Y coordinate is negative. So notice that after that, if we do tim.show, Tim is a totally new object. And Tim right now doesn't move, it is just stuck at the bottom. So each of these things are separate entities, separate objects. We're right now just telling Bob to move and show himself, and Tim is just stuck here because Tim doesn't know how to move, it's just show. So note, compare the lines of code needed in the object-oriented way compared to like the non-object-oriented way. When making more objects, you no longer have that repetitive initialize, declare, and copy and pasting code using similar variables. All that you need to do is like repeat the name, maybe create an array of these objects, because you've already done all the hard work in defining this bubble object, this fancy bubble variable. Questions, comments? So that's the new stuff. For I think assignment 14,